Hello, everyone. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Yes. Hi, this is Vositha Wijenayake. I work as the Executive Director of SLYCAN. And I would like to welcome all of you today to this webinar, where we are starting off a series of webinars focusing on climate migration, displacement, and how we can address this issue in different perspectives. A bit of an overview of what SLYCAN Trust does. SLYCAN Trust is a civil society think tank. We work mainly on policy and legal analysis, as well as on the ground work, which link to our research. And the work we do focuses on climate change, sustainable development, ecosystem and biodiversity conservation, animal welfare, and also social justice. And as part of our work on climate change, we have as one of the key themes, work on climate migration. And we have two amazing speakers today on this webinar. We have Mr. Joseph Epitu, who is the Assistant Commissioner in Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. And we also have Ms. Fleur Newman, who is Unit Lead for Action for Climate Empowerment in the UNFCCC Secretariat. There'll be a brief introduction to them before they start speaking, but highlighting on the issue that we're focusing on, climate migration. So all of you, I'm obviously guessing that you're interested in this topic. That's why you're joining us. You've heard of the term refugees, and then we have today a term called climate refugees. But then how does climate refugees fit into the purview of how refugees are addressed? And what you would have read or already know is that the Refugee Convention, that is the international law that targets the issue of refugees, does not cover the refugees we are talking about relating to climate change, because most of them could be displaced within their own country, and the elements that cover being a refugee, the definition does not necessarily encompass those who are migrants because of climate change. So today we will see two sides to this story. Mr. Epitu would be focusing on how in Uganda they have refugees, which fall under the category of international law as refugees, and how climate change has been functioning as a stressor, or how the refugee flow is impacting the environment and then contributing to climate change maybe. And then Ms. Newman would be focusing on how the concept of climate migration links up with other perspectives such as gender, and how things that we don't think of when we talk about the word or the concept usually need to be highlighted, the vulnerabilities, the groups that are within the process. And you would also know that there's, under the World International Mechanism for Loss and Damage in the UNFCCC process, there's a task force that has been set up which focuses on migration, and they have already published a report on this. And SLYCAN Trust is also working on this at national level. So SLYCAN works in different parts of the world. We work in Asia and we work in Africa at national level, focusing on different aspects. So our work in Sri Lanka, for example, has research on climate migration and displacement due to droughts and other reasons that connect to climate risks. And then we also have discovered how this has led to women-led households and children and women being left behind while there's temporary migration due to lack of work or agriculture being impacted. So I think you could always link up with our website that has the knowledge products that's available, and we'll be discussing this evidence that we found in different upcoming webinars as well. So without further taking more time, I will pass the mic to Mr. Epitu, who has a very informative presentation today, which I am looking forward to listening to. So, and then followed by Ms. Newman. Mr. Epitu, if you could activate the mic and the video, I'll put the presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Vositha and colleagues. I'm happy to be part of this discussion. As Vositha already mentioned, my name is Joseph Epitu, and I work with the Ministry of Water and Environment as Assistant Commissioner responsible for capacity development. But I've also been part of the climate change negotiations on behalf of Uganda. And I'm happy to share with you our experiences with the climate migration as a country. By way of introduction, as you can see Uganda is a host to about 1.3 million refugees, which amounts to about 3.3% of our current total population as at June last year. And again, we are amongst, we're one of the countries that is a host to the highest refugee population in the world. Now, the majority of our refugees come from South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Somalia, and Rwanda. And according to our country's 2006 Refugee Act and 2010 regulations, our refugees are uniquely handled in such a way that when they come, they live amongst the rural communities. So we don't keep them in concentration camps like in most countries. They become part and parcel of the communities. Now, most of the refugees live largely amongst the rural communities. And of course, they are dependent on the environment and natural resources. And this, of course, puts a lot of pressures and demands on government and the attendant resources. Like I said, external refugees have a big impact on environment and biodiversity. And of course, their demands on the ecosystems are quite great. And that have to do a lot also with the impacts on climate change. I just want to share with you in that slide the map of Uganda and the areas where the refugee population is concentrated in Uganda. If you look up next on the top left-hand hand, you will see areas marked blue. Those are areas where we have the highest refugee population in the country. And as you can see, up north is Southern Sudan. On the west is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then down also we have refugees coming from Southern Sudan. And then if you look at the middle of the map, we have some of the places where the refugees are settled. Some of them are also highlighted in yellow. And those are basically the refugee hosting places. Just to share with you the statistics in terms of population status, there is some interesting statistic on this slide. If you look at the total refugee population is about 1.3, as I mentioned, 1.2, 1.3. But if you look at the composition of the refugees, you will note that 95% of the refugees stay in the rural areas or they live in the settlements. But of those, 83% of them are women. And this is very telling because the refugees in Uganda are a little bit different from the ordinary refugees we know about. Most of these, because of the colonial boundaries, have relatives on the other side of the borders. So when there are conflicts, they just move on to the Ugandan side, and most of them stay with their relatives. And those are where the refugee settlements are also found. But you'll note that the higher number of female gender here is because most of the men remain on the other side of the border and then send in the women and the children to the Ugandan side, and they keep checking on them regularly. And then you'll also note that of these, 5% of the refugees move into the urban areas. And again, because of the Ugandan liberal policy where refugees are not confined to the settlements as such. Those who can afford can move into the urban areas, and they are also allowed to work and integrate with the local population. And in the urban areas, you'll also note that the youth particularly comprise the higher percentage next to the women, because they then also take advantage of that to get into other opportunities, like getting work in the urban areas and the rest. Now, in Uganda, we have two categories of refugees, as already mentioned earlier by Vositha. We have the external refugees that come from the neighboring countries that I earlier mentioned: Southern Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Somalia. Now, those refugees are normally driven because of the conflicts in their various countries. And also, they could be driven by ethnic differences, internal ethnic conflicts, and fights and wars. So those are driven by conflicts, and both political and ethnic. But also we have what we could classify as internal refugees within the country. These are people who are largely, they stay within the country, but because of climate change impacts, they are affected, and then they have to be relocated to some parts of the country. And these impacts include, among others, floods and droughts. And then also there's a lot of pressure on the environment and natural resources arising from population increase. And these two major factors then contribute to internal migrations. We have particularly two areas: the mountainous areas of Mount Elgon, which is in the eastern part of the country, which is prone to floods, and also we have in the western part of the country, the one area called Kasese, which is also prone to floods. Kasese is located on the Mount Rwenzori area. So normally during the rainy season, such as it is now, they experience major floods, and that normally drives the population into other parts of the country. But also, we have internal migration caused by persistent droughts, particularly in what we call the cattle corridor parts of the country, in the Karamoja sub-region. These droughts are normally very, very persistent, and the local population here then tend to migrate to other areas, either neighboring districts, or they go into urban areas. And that's why when you come to Kampala, most of the street children are from a particular part of the country. These are largely driven by climate migration arising from persistent droughts. In the next few slides, I just share with you the impacts of climate change, which subsequently contribute to internal migration in the country. Right now, we are going through the rainy season, and the picture on the screen is what happened last week in the Kasese area. The floods destroyed a whole hospital, regional referral hospital, which you can see there. And patients had to be driven out of the hospital to other parts of the locality where the floods are not existing. We have had quite a number of deaths, people being killed because of the floods. You can see communities on the top right, top left picture, trying to remove mud from their settlements, and of course the hospital therein. Again, pictures of the Kasese floods and the hospital. How does climate change, how do refugees contribute to climate change, and how does climate change impact on the refugees? Refugees that come from outside, particularly the external refugees, have a big impact on climate change. They both contribute, but they're also affected by climate change. And how do they do this? One, when these refugees come, they are hosted amongst the rural communities. And because they depend on the natural resources, largely wood fuel for cooking, and then also the agriculture, they then go into massive deforestation, cutting trees for construction of their huts, for cooking, and also for agriculture. And to that extent, they also impact on the wetlands, which is a big habitat for biomass, for biodiversity in the country. So eventually they impact directly on the environment. And of course, they also, this eventually now contributes to deforestation. But they are also affected by climate change in that by the time they already come into an environment which has already been stressed by climate change over the years. So when they come, it's not business as usual. They already find the environment destroyed, and they contribute further to its destruction. They also, of course, then impact on the water resources, both surface and underground, because now we have to sink a lot of boreholes, and those boreholes, of course, impact on the underground water recharge, and these recharges cannot readily be replenished because of the destruction of the environment. The forests contribute to the rainfall, and once they are destroyed, then we cannot have recharge. They also contribute to water pollution, and as I mentioned, the depletion of the groundwater resources, land degradation, and of course air pollution. And this contribute directly to the drivers of climate change. As I mentioned earlier, they cut down trees, they go into agriculture, and all those impact on, some of them even go into timber business, which of course directly now also contribute to climate change. And of course, the competition for diminishing natural resources between the refugees and the hosting communities then also lead into conflict. And these have a lot of impacts on the peace and security of the refugee hosting areas. That's just a picture of which was taken last week of timber business involving one of the rare species of timber now remaining in the country, which is being cut and destroyed within the refugee hosting districts in the western region of Uganda. In terms of the internal refugees, we have a lot of impacts with regards on the effects on the cultural norms and practices. Normally, as I mentioned earlier, the communities that are being impacted by climate change in the country through floods and drought live in the mountainous areas, apart from those impacted by drought who live in the plains. Now, those who live in the mountainous areas, now normally what government has done is to relocate them to the plains. And this has had a very big impact on their cultural norms. First of all, the environment is completely different. They live in the mountains and now they have to be relocated to the plains. Their cultures are different. Even the traditional practices are different. So this have a very big impact on their cultural practices and also norms, but also they end up being detached from their traditional heritage. And this has had the effect of some of them even refusing to relocate, and of course, when the next rains come, they again get affected. And then even on the impacts also manifest itself on the agricultural practices. In the mountainous areas, they mainly grow bananas for food, and when they come to the plains, those areas don't support the growth of bananas, so they also have a challenge then. And of course, eventually it contributes to the economic. They also impacts on them economically. You have just witnessed the destruction of the infrastructure, the hospitals, the bridges, the road networks, so largely then becomes difficult for them to transport their produce. The market becomes also difficult for them to be accessed by development partners who may want to support them in one way or the other. Now, let me just share with you the implications of refugee migration on gender, the female gender in the country. Now, as I earlier on mentioned, the refugee communities survive largely on the environment. That's fuel wood, the water resources, and most of these resources are normally obtained by the female gender. So you'll find that it's the women one and cut the firewood for cooking. They are the ones who go and fetch the water. They are the ones who fetch the firewood for construction of the huts, the mud and wattle huts, which you saw some in earlier slides. So the fact that these resources are already depleted means that the women have to move longer distances to obtain these resources. And of course, that also impacts on their other activities, both social and economic. But we have also witnessed an increase in sexual and gender-based violence with significant numbers of women and children being part of that process. And of course, this also is exacerbated by the fact that already the traditional cultures have negative regulations as far as the female gender is concerned. So the refugee migration even makes it more complicated when now they have to be part of those cultural practices in foreign lands. As you have seen in the earlier pictures, destruction of the health systems, for instance, have direct impact on marital health of the female gender. And this, of course, weakens further their health status. But if you also go to some parts of the country, like the Karamoja sub-region, where the female gender is the one responsible for construction of the huts, the houses where the communities they live, the fact that the environment is already ravaged and affected by the migration means that the women can no longer access those materials easily. And then, of course, as the environment continues to be destructed, their livelihoods are even much more impacted on. And then in some communities, like in Southern Sudan and DRC, sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war. And the existing legal framework does not favor the female gender at all in this, in as far as resolution of conflicts are concerned. And in any case, in refugee environments, they are even non-existent. Again, I did mention already the fact that as the refugees move into new environments, the resources become even more difficult to access. And this also applies to education, because the female gender has to be involved in collection of firewood, collection of water. They have to be part of the agricultural process to feed the other members of the family. As you looked at the statistics, the majority of the refugees are the female gender. So the men remain behind in Southern Sudan, in DRC, and then the women remain with the children in the refugee hosting areas. And because of that, they cannot have the time to participate in education. They cannot have time to participate in other economic activities. So this has a very big impact on the female gender. And then, of course, like I did mention earlier, the justice system is also not favorable to the female gender. And all these are impacted largely because of migration. Now, how has the Ministry of Water and Environment, or the water and environment sector generally, tried to address the challenges arising from refugee migration? The refugee issues in Uganda are handled under the Office of the Prime Minister, with the respective relevant sectors coming on board to address specific issues relevant to their sectors. So for instance, if it's water and environment, or if it's water and environment issues, then my ministry comes on board to address those issues related to water, to ensure that the refugees have adequate water, the refugees manage the environment properly, the refugees manage the natural resources properly. And if it's health, then the health sector comes in. If it's education, the education sector comes in. If it's gender, then the Ministry of Gender and Labor comes in. And if it's agriculture, then the Ministry of Agriculture comes in. So accordingly, as a country, all sectors have been tasked to develop a comprehensive refugee response framework. And for the Ministry of Water and Environment, we have just finalized our refugee response framework for the water and environment sector. It was launched in February this year. And the framework basically provides the strategies and the guidelines that will inform our responses to the refugees in Uganda in as far as water and environment resources, management of the water and environment resources are concerned. Now, this refugee response frameworks is an outcrop of the global framework, and it's only operationalized. Uganda is operationalized in many countries, Uganda being one of them. And as the lead sector responsible for water and environment, we are responsible for planning and coordinating the sector's response to address challenges related to water and environment and climate change, because climate change is also hosted by our ministry. And our response framework covers all those areas. This framework is also aligned to the country's national development plans, but also the global SDGs. And it's guided by a number of government policies, plans, frameworks, the linkages to several international and regional commitments. Now, in the framework, as a sector, we have mainstreamed gender and youth across all our activities. And that also includes climate change and energy aspects with regard to wood fuel and solar energy. We have also encouraged all our partners that are involved in the refugee response to integrate gender and environment mitigation measures with emergency preparedness, response, stabilization, and empowerment measures across not only in our sectors, but also in the sector that they're involved in as far as the refugees are concerned. The framework also provides for livelihood support, focusing on the youth and female gender. As you saw in the earlier presentations, these are the two very vulnerable groups. So our refugee response framework provides for support to the youth and the female gender, including their involvement in tree planting initiatives, purposely to ensure that there is adequate supply of firewood for future refugees. Historically, Uganda has hosted refugees for the last 50 years or so, and if refugees keep going back and forth. So we have permanent areas which are designated for hosting refugees. So those areas is where those refugees come and stay. So the sustainability of their stay for longer periods is catered for in the refugee response plan. The plan also encourages the use of cleaner energy technologies such as improved cook stoves, solar energy for cooking, and also in terms of water, with the framework also provides for a comprehensive plan for provision of water and sanitation facilities for the refugees. And in all these, we are encouraging the youth and female gender to be part of for instance, making of the cook stoves and all these activities so that they also generate some income out of it as part of the process. And then also, as part of the response plan, the framework provides for vocational skilling of the youth, particularly, as I mentioned, in the construction of energy-saving cook stoves, raising of seedlings, and also repair and maintenance of water infrastructure. And once they enter into this business, then they also generate some income from it. And then, of course, alongside that, there's also a comprehensive strategy to equip them with entrepreneurial skills so that they are able to improve on their economic businesses. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we have generally in the framework ensured that there has to be increased provision of water and sanitation services in the refugee hosting areas. I think that should be almost bring me to the end of my presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Joseph Epitu, for that very informative presentation. We are a bit over the time, but I think it was very helpful for us to have all the information so that we can connect the different elements of how general refugee crisis and then how climate stresses contribute to the process and how we need to address the issues of climate migration as well as also the rights and needs of the refugees. So thank you very much. We'll be taking questions after the presentations. So please hold your questions until then. We'll take now Ms. Fleur Newman's presentation and then we'll go to questions. She's leading the work on Action for Climate Empowerment, and I think most of her work relates to a lot of things that Mr. Epitu highlighted as well. So you can connect the two, and I'm sure you'll enjoy her presentation.
Thank you very much, Vositha. And yes, I think there are certainly going to be some connections made based on the previous presentation. So I thought I would actually sort of step back a little bit from the specifics of climate to start with, to step back a little bit from the specifics of climate migration and displacement to talk about the differentiated impacts of climate change, because this relates not only to in this context, but in other contexts. So in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the 5th assessment report, it was identified that differences in vulnerability and exposure arise from non-climatic factors and from multi-dimensional inequalities. So these differences shape a differential risk from climate change, and people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalised are especially vulnerable to climate change. and also to the responses that are put in place, whether they're adaptation or mitigation. And that this heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. Rather, it's the product of intersecting social pressures that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure. These social processes include, for example, discrimination on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. And I think that came out in the previous presentation when you're seeing that there are intersecting challenges, whether it's due to conflict or climate change. Subsequently, the UNFCCC Secretariat, the gender team, prepared a synthesis report based on submissions we'd received as an activity under the previous Lima work program on gender and its gender action plan. And unsurprisingly, it showed similar outcomes to the IPCC report. And there were three broad themes on how the impacts of climate change are differentiated, as the IPCC had identified in relation to actual or perceived increase in vulnerability of individuals, groups, or communities, but also who is involved in the decision making and in attitudes towards responses to climate change. Who benefits from action on climate change impacts. So the differentiation is not only in relation to vulnerability, but also in relation to who's making the decision and who benefits. And the most frequently cited reasons for women's increased vulnerability, and this is not because of that they were born female, but because of these reasons. And this is to climate change impacts, including reduced resilience and adaptive capacity when compared to men, included discriminatory patriarchal laws, norms, customs, and traditions that resulted in women's exclusion from participating in decision-making and community processes, limited awareness of legal rights, including human rights, limited or no access to or control over resources and assets, and significantly an unequal burden of unpaid domestic and care responsibilities, and that came out also in the previous presentation. Limited access to necessary sexual and reproductive health care, particularly in natural disaster situations, and the example that was given there of the hospital and the impact on maternity care is very stark. And increased exposure to based harassment and violence, and impoverishment, including when a male spouse migrates or otherwise leaves the household. So in the context of migration and displacement, and this came out quite strongly in the previous presentation, that forced migration due to climate events, and that's due to climate events that are directly related to climate events, so flooding, I've lost my presentation, but flooding and hurricanes or drought, but also changes related to climate change creating issues with that cause conflict. So, you know, that there's both direct impacts, and then there's also impacts that are sort of less direct. It increases the risk of sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and sexual and gender-based violence. This is a risk of migration for particularly for women, but not only for women, but particularly for women. But it also has a complex impact on women and gender dynamics. When women are left behind by male migrants, for instance, whilst this may result in more autonomy and decision making because they become the de facto head of household, in practice and in reality, due to those laws and norms, male migration can exacerbate the poverty of rural women because men have migrated. There's lower reserves of labour, and the norms and customs requiring permission from absent male kin can't be fulfilled. So things like decisions on the purchase of agricultural equipment, or the choice of production, or livelihoods, or changes to those are not possible. And women may face additional discrimination when they migrate from rural to urban centres for work because of historical and discrimination related to who is educated as a child, and the ability of women in rural situations to have had an education that would allow them to have something more than an unskilled labour job, domestic labour job in an urban environment. And those jobs tend to be lower paid and very high in terms of work hours. And equally, going to the point about decision making and participation, a project in the Pacific Climate Change and Migration Project, through a household survey on risk, identified a number of differentiations. So migration was seen in this context as an adaptation measure. And women suggested moving inland as a reaction to floods and coastal erosion or high tides, whereas men generally were proposing the building of seawalls. And women suggested moving to places with lower salinity intrusion to deal with water management issues, and that was something that was identified, or even though women and men both identified that this was a critical issue, it was women who were suggesting to move to the lower salinity intrusion areas. Men identified overcrowded homes due to internal immigration, and the consequential security issues. And overall, women mentioned migration in this context positively, while men focused on other measures and pointed out potential challenges arising from migration. And the point of this is not to say that either women or men were perhaps more right, or that one of those choices was better than the other. The point of this is to say that if you only ever are engaging men, or you're only ever engaging women, which is fairly rare, but if you're only ever engaging men, then you are missing out on not only the perspectives and needs of women in this context, but also ideas that might not otherwise come up. So what does that mean? What does the UNFCCC do, and how does all of this relate to that work? I'm not going to go into the history of gender under the UNFCCC, but suffice to say that at the moment we have, as a result of adoption at COP25 last year, an enhanced gender work program and action plan that runs from 2020 to 2024. The Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender, as it's known, and its Gender Action Plan is made up of the work program, which is a sort of guiding framework that has long-term open-ended action. And it also specifies how the Secretariat is to support this work. That includes things like an invitation to countries to nominate a national gender and climate change focal point, and for the Secretariat to facilitate support to those focal points. And it also requests, among other things, that the Secretariat facilitate coordination with other United Nations entities, intergovernmental organisations and non-governmental organisations, and that includes CSOs, when supporting implementation. So our role is a facilitator and building connections on support to this work. The work program includes as an annex the Gender Action Plan, and there are 5 priority areas for all of the activities under that Gender Action Plan. And those priority areas are built on what has been identified over a number of years within the UNFCCC process as critical to ensuring that the goals on gender responsive climate policy are become reality. And so those 5 priority areas are capacity building, knowledge management and communication, gender balance, participation and women's leadership, and this is within the UNFCCC process, so the negotiating process, but also more broadly. Coherence, which is across the UNFCCC, so from climate finance through to technology, through to capacity building, mitigation and adaptation, but also a sort of coherence in the work that's happening at a UN level. Gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, and that includes all means of implementation of finance, capacity building and technology development and transfer, and monitoring and reporting under our process. Reporting is a very important component because it allows for transparency and for the learning from the sharing of experiences. And there are 20 activities that sit within those priority areas. One of the things that came out of this that's important in this context is that there was learning from the previous Lima work program on gender and its gender action plan and the IPCC finding. And so for the first time in the UNFCCC process, there is this reference to the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men, and also to the fact that this is due to inequalities and multi-dimensional factors. So this is not because of any kind of inherent vulnerability of women. There is an activity under the Gender Action Plan about enhancing the availability of sex disaggregated data for gender analysis. This is important. You saw the very useful graphic of what the differentiation was in terms of who was migrating, and that's a very important information to have. So the ability to collect and apply sex disaggregated data is critical. And there is an activity under the Gender Action Plan which seeks to increase the evidence base and the understanding of these differentiated impacts and how that can inform better climate policy and action. So that has a number of outputs, and there's also other activities which look to provide things like capacity building and capacity building at a country level, but it's also, there's activities related to capacity building for the constituted bodies under the UNFCCC process, and that includes the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. So the Secretariat has provided capacity building support on for constituted bodies in looking at how they can integrate agenda considerations into their own work, and that has happened also for the Executive Committee of the WIM. And I'll just end this on sort of a practical, I really like this diagram, which was prepared by the NAP Global Network, because what it shows is, you know, when we talk about integrating gender considerations, and we've seen what the practical impacts are in terms of what that looks like in the Ugandan country experience. But when we're talking about what the solution is, this is a useful diagram to show what that actually means from a practical perspective. And you know, that there are these enabling factors around institutional arrangements, so coordination at a national and a national to local level, information sharing about what works and what challenges there are, and the tools that are available, capacity development so that people understand why they need to be considering these things and how to do so, and then having it integrated into implementation measures, so in the planning and in implementation, that it's part of the monitoring and evaluation framework. And so all of these things together are practical ways in which gender responsiveness can be built into climate policy and action. And final slide is where you can find information on the UNFCCC website in relation to gender in the context of a number of different areas. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fleur, for the presentation. Now we can open the floor to those who want to have questions answered. So I saw one already available for Ms. Epitu. If you can, yes, there you go, to Fleur. Or even maybe, Fleur, if you could answer that question in general, and then Joseph could take over to link it to Uganda specifically. Would you mind answering this? Because I think it was in your presentation also, these elements mentioned in the first.
I mean, I don't know what the specifics were Mr. Epitu was referring to, but in many justice systems there are discriminations. There's discrimination against women, or there is not sufficient support or protection in relation to issues of gender-based violence. For instance, there may not be laws that prevent early child marriage, or there may be laws that are not capable of prosecuting in this context. I'm assuming that that's what was being referred to in that case, but I'm not 100% sure.
Right. Fleur, this is for you.
I'll answer the second part first. Refugees are not specifically identified in the context of the Lima Work Program. It's the activity reflect the fact that the development of national policy plans, strategies in relation to climate change are driven from a national perspective, so that the activities within the Gender Action Plan are intended to be a country does have where refugees are being considered through their national policy, then activities under the Gender Action Plan applied to that context, but they are not specifically identified as a group. But as I said, there is a constituted body within the process, the Executive Committee of the International Mechanism of Loss and Damage, which looks at the issues of migration. And as with all constituted bodies, there is a requirement to consider or to report on how they are progressing on integrating gender considerations in their work. So in that context, they would also be included. I'm not sure how, in the context of gender being contextualized, I'm not sure if that's how gender is defined, and it's not within the Lima Work Program.
The question was on the justice system. Now, as Newman mentioned earlier, the refugee hosting communities rely largely on their original traditional justice system, which they come with from their various countries. And in most of these traditional justice systems, the law is skewed in favor of the male gender, because they are the ones involved in decision making. And they come along with those justice systems once they migrate to the country. And so even when now you get the impacts, the female gender is impacted by by climate change, like having to go and fetch firewood from long distances, they become vulnerable, they may get raped. Once you get those cases, then they are not solved within the country's legal system. In most cases, they are sorted out within the respective ethnic group traditional systems. For instance, if I give you the example of cases of rape, in most traditional systems, these are normally sorted out amicably by either the other side paying some cows to the parents of the girl who has been raped, and in that case, the girl does not have any say, or the female gender does not have any say. So that's what I was meaning with by saying the justice system is not in favor of the female refugees. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Joseph. Shall we go to the next question?
For those that migrate because of climate change hazards and resource land, is this a permanent migration? Now, initially, what the country had, the government had put in place was to make it a migration which is not permanent. They go to those areas only during the rainy season, and then when the rain subsides, they go back to their areas. But what has happened now is that the distances are sometimes very, very far, that it becomes difficult for them to go back. Now, like the government set up some settlement camps in a place called Kiriandongo, which is at the center of the country, for internal refugees from the mountainous areas of Mount Elgon, which is about 3 to 4 hours drive. Now, a peasant cannot make it back from Kiriandongo to Mbali. But so what happens that when they reach those new areas, they find they cannot cope with the environment. Of course, they have tried to construct for them some shelters, sanitation facilities, but the urge to be amongst their communities make it difficult for them to continue staying there. So they prefer to go back to their original places of abode. I hope I've been able to respond to
that. Okay, so a question from Siddharth. Do we have instances where the compensation incentives aid provided to climate refugees are also gender discriminatory somehow? Would Fleur take this? But I think we need to make a correction.
No. When it comes from government, it's not there's no discrimination, because most of this the aid comes from the UNHCR. So there's no discrimination as far as the gender is concerned.
Right. So thank you. I think we need to make a correction that climate refugees term might not be used when we are giving compensation. Fleur, do you want to add anything to this question, or shall we go to another?
I would just like to say that it's not necessarily discrimination, but I have heard of instances or cases where, because women were not consulted in terms of what was needed or what was possible after an event, there was a case of a woman who received a boat as a replacement after a hurricane, and without having spoken to her or her being involved in her the compensation that was provided, it was of no use to her in that context, and it didn't serve the need that she had, and it didn't actually replace what she lost. So the discrimination may not come, it's sort of more directly, it can come because there isn't sufficient attention paid at the time that either the compensation is being provided, or in terms of things like insurance, and that there is discrimination in that context.
Can I just add to what Newman has just submitted?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. The discrimination may not come out at the official level, but normally when these compensations and incentives are provided to the households, as soon as they are given, then the traditional cultural systems take center stage. So for instance, if food is given to a household, when it comes to decision making on the use of that food, the men then sometimes take over. And that's where the discrimination comes in now, but not at the official government level. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. There's a, yeah, okay, I can hear myself for some reason. But okay, so there's a question that's there on high-level action, what high-level actions could be taken to address the impacts that are being faced. It specifically focuses on Pakistan, but I think maybe it could be converted to an open question as to how high-level action could be taken to address the issue of climate migration. Fleur, would you like to start answering, and then maybe we can get a response from Joseph as well.
And I would at this point point out that I am not an expert in migration policy, but in this context, this is one of the reasons why institutional coordination is so important, and why, because climate change is so cross-cutting across economies and societies, having those government departments that are dealing with migration, for instance, coordination mechanisms for how to address climate change, is an important component, just as it is to or the equivalent, also engaging in that work. And because there needs to be the connection between the increase or the impact of climate change in this context and the responses to that.
Thank you very much. Joseph, if you could add a few words, if you like.
What needs to be done, and that's what we are trying to do in Uganda, is that the refugees should be involved in the coordination framework. So for instance, when there are local government meetings, when there are national meetings, refugees are part and parcel of the membership of the task forces. And specifically then, the female gender should be part and parcel of that task force. So there should be quotas directly allotted to the female gender, so that they can be also, their views and decisions can be included in decision making. But more specifically, this arrangement should also be taken up the global level. Whenever UNFCCC is organizing meetings, it would be nice if the refugees themselves are also considered to be part of those engagements, so that they air the real situation on the ground, and their voices can then be heard directly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. We are actually running out of time. So if I could request the two speakers to have their closing remarks and also answer this question with it, that'll be great to save time. Who would like to go first? Fleur, do you want to go first? And if you would like to answer this question, you could as well. And the same applies to Mr. Epitu.
Thanks. I think one of the things about migration and climate change is that these are not only cross-cutting, but they are transboundary. These are issues that are very difficult for countries to necessarily deal with on their own, and so it does require collaborative multilateralism in order for responses to be comprehensive and to be fair. And I think the challenge, of course, for countries is to find ways in which to balance both the their own, your own needs, the country's needs, and those of neighbouring countries. In terms of whether or not one country should be to dealing with the pollution that occurs as a result of migration, I think this is something that it practically is something that needs to be dealt with from the country who's receiving the migrants. But then there's ways in which I guess countries can cooperate and to because migration is also something that is happens not in waves, so it doesn't always happen consistently in the same country or within the same country. So answers that question. But really, I guess my key message here is that this is something that countries do need to deal with themselves, but it's also something that has to be done from a multilateral perspective.
Thank you very much. Can we have the closing remarks from Mr. Epitu as well?
Webinar, and I think we have shared a lot, and I'm happy to be part of similar webinars in the future if there's something I can contribute. With regard to this particular question, I really don't know how to bring on board the countries that pollute, because in the context of Uganda, our refugees are largely economic refugees, especially those who migrate from the neighboring countries. Apart from the internal refugees who are largely also driven by climate change. But I think it's something that could be taken up the global discussion to see how the international community can support some of these challenges that the receiving countries are experiencing. Thank you.
Okay, so a big thank you to speakers today, and also to those who joined us on the webinar portal as well as via FB Live. A big thank you for staying with us. We look forward to having you in the next discussions as well, which will focus on legal aspects as well as specific actions under the UNFCCC process, like the Boston International Mechanism does. So keep your emails checked in, because we'll be inviting you for the next ones as well. And from us here at SLYCAN Trust, it's goodbye for now. Thank you. Bye.